Hello, my name is Brandace, and I'm part of the Instructional Leadership Program at Jacksonville State University. And my capstone presentation is based on my action research titled Improving Reading Scores on the STAR Assessment for Second Grade Students at Albertville Primary School. I chose to do the study because I had noticed when I analyzed data, testing data over several years, that second grade students at Albertville Primary School scored significantly lower on the STAR reading assessment than they did on the STAR math assessment. And as you see here, when you compare the scores, especially of the ADA or above benchmark, it's very obvious that there's a learning gap between the math and the reading scores. And so my goal was to close that learning gap. The hypothesis I had was that if I increased reading volume, chose appropriate text complexity, integrated interactive read alouds, and developed self awareness in the readers, that I would see the number of students who were at or above benchmark on the STAR assessment increase. And so when looking at the action research group, I had 36 students involved. That was 2 classrooms. The ethnicity was about 60% Hispanic and 40% not Hispanic, white, not Hispanic. The language proficiency, there were 13 English learners in the group. And the free and reduced lunch count, although our student qualifies for community eligibility where they all eat free, when you break it down and get the actual statistics, around 75% of the student population and of the action research group was also qualified for free and reduced lunch. So you can, the demographics of the action research group are representative of the school as well. And so there's a large English learner population. About 60% of the school population is Hispanic. And so that also, presents several challenges as far as, especially when you're dealing with reading scores. When I started examining literature related to how to improve reading scores, there were several strategies that kept coming up and I kept seeing represented in the literature. The first was about reading volume, increasing reading volume of students. And Richard Allington in 2014 said the amount of time that students spend reading connected text in the day should be great. And he said he likened it to the old saying, the rich get richer. And so what happens is your readers actually become better readers because they're actually reading more every day. And when he examined classrooms across the nation, he saw that during the reading block of the day, students were spending actually very little time actually reading connected text. And so one of the strategies that I identified and targeted was to increase their reading volume every day. Another was also by Richard Allington in an article in 2015 where he talked about how when students read and spend that time reading, increasing their reading volume, that it's very important that they read books that are in the right text complexity and so that they can be read with around at least 95% accuracy. If they're struggling through the text, then they're not really actually able to use that reading volume to grow as readers. Another strategy identified was from Dela Cruz in 2013, where, they and she actually suggested the integration of interactive read alouds. And an interactive read aloud is when it's actually an instructional activity in which the teacher carefully selects literature. So it's not just go grab a book off the shelf, but you're really being thoughtful about and deliberate about the literature that you're choosing to read. And you're going to choose literature that's rich in language, and then you're going to read that literature to students, and you're going to support conversations that happen about the literature and about the vocabulary within the text. And so it's a very deliberate instructional activity that needs to take place. And then the last was Eiflerbach in 2013 talked about how self-awareness in a reader is often very underdeveloped. And so, you know, students depend on teachers to tell them how they're doing. And so, developing that self-awareness in students by putting some self-monitoring pieces in place allows them to control more of their learning. And it says students believing that they can succeed at reading tasks and then doing so are evidence of reading development. So obviously the goal is to become self-aware, and so the way to do that would be through some self-awareness lessons. So looking at the methods and the study design for the action research, like I said, I had 36 students. These were 2 classrooms out of, well, in the school we have 57 classrooms. And so I was going to take 2 classrooms to be the action research group, and the other classes would serve as the control groups. And so implement the targeted strategies of increased reading volume, the appropriate text complexity, the interactive read alouds, and the self-awareness lessons. And then I'm going to monitor, or I did monitor, the growth through benchmark assessments that were given at the beginning of the year before the study took place, and then actually in the middle of the year and at the end of the year. And then I would analyze the assessment results, and I would actually compare the reading and math assessment results of the action research group, and then I would compare the results of the action research group to the control group. And so to analyze the findings there. And so then after I did that, I found 2 findings. Targeted strategies did close the gap between reading and math, and that urgent intervention groups showed the greatest improvement. The activities actually started around August of that year, right when school started. I gave the benchmark assessment for the beginning of the year, and then those assessments were given August, November, January, and in the spring and April. And so I started after each benchmark assessment. I would then support my students in selecting appropriate text complexity. And I did this through the zone of proximal development that's listed on the STAR report for students. And so after each benchmark assessment, I would then support the students in trying to identify what level books kind of fell in their just right category. Self-awareness lessons were integrated into the reading curriculum that we used, which was Units of Study in Reading by Lucy Calkins. And then the strategy of interactive read aloud, the goal was to at least implement that 3 days a week. And there were some weeks where it was implemented more, I would say. Self-selected reading time, the goal was to provide at least 30 minutes a day of self-selected reading time. And so the students were allowed to choose what they read, but encouraged to read within that appropriate text complexity. So looking at the findings, this is of the action research group, the end of the year data. And we look at the at or above benchmark group. For reading, 53% were at or above benchmark, and 50% were in math were at or above benchmark. And so you can see, compared to the data we looked at the beginning, this is much closer, much more closely related, almost identical, honestly. And the overall scores were lower this year, but this was the actual year following the COVID-19 outbreak where school had to be ended early. And so I feel like, and most educators felt like at this point that students showed less progress than they typically do because of the lack of time they had, instruction the year before. And you can also see on down to the urgent intervention group was exactly the same, 5% for reading and math. And so this was just, like I said, for the action research group. And so based on these, you can tell that the at or above benchmark group, that gap between reading and math, it disappeared. In fact, students scored higher in reading this time than math, and that had not been the pattern over the prior 3 years to this assessment. Now, when you compare the data of the action research group to the school-wide data, or the second grade data, actually, the control group, you can see the at or above benchmark is virtually the same. We're talking 1% different. But where we noticed a huge change, or where I noticed a huge change, was in the urgent intervention group. So when you're looking down here, only 5% of students in the action research group scored in the urgent intervention category, compared to 22% of the control group. And so that was a surprise and a major finding for the action research. So based on that, the conclusions and implications from the study was that the targeted strategies did improve reading assessment scores, and that the urgent intervention group showed the greatest amount of improvement. And the final was that the targeted strategies are effective for English learners. And the way that I derived that conclusion was based on the roster of students that were in the urgent intervention group at the beginning of the school year versus who was in there at the end. And it was urgent intervention group was filled with several, well, mostly English learners. And so when you compare that to the control group, who did not see that huge change in the urgent intervention group, then we can conclude that these strategies are effective for English learners, which could have huge implications for all elementary and early childhood teachers, but especially those that are instructors of English learners. So quite a few references used, and they're all linked here on this slide, cited here. And so the second plan, or the second activity that I want to share with you, was the diversity plan that I wrote in the instructional leadership program. And so when you look at the student demographics at Albertville Primary School, and I've already spoken to you about that, but I said around 60%, and at this particular time, and it varies from day to day, but at the particular time when I wrote this plan, it was 57.1% Hispanic and 37.2% of white or Caucasian. So you can see the green, the Black African American, although it is a low number, it is definitely a significant number. The students are there, and a very small population of Asian students. One thing that I noticed during the research that I did for my diversity plan was that the majority of student growth for students happens in the early grades. And so you can see, the size of the growth that happens in the second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, and you can see those pieces getting much smaller as you get up to the higher grades. This shows how incredibly important it is that those foundational years, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade, are handled correctly so that students can maximize their learning and can reach their greatest potential. Banks said in 2016 that while the nation's students are becoming increasingly diverse, most of the nation's teachers are white. And that is certainly what I found in my research of my system, which has lots of diversity, but among the teaching staff, it did not. And so my goal, or what I suggested, was we need to increase the diversity of the staff, the teaching staff of Albertville Primary School. And when we do, research shows that you maximize student learning, and you can also strengthen relationships with parents. It's just kind of a give and take thing. When one improves, so does the other. And so I came up with some suggestions to support these learners, and for the students, being part of the WIDA consortium is a way to support them and make that their needs are being met, and having a developed ESL program is another way. For parents, a way to support parents was making sure to translate materials, and not only materials but messages that are sent home, and that's something that I have really seen a need for in my experience as a classroom teacher of students that speak English as a second language, and certainly have parents that do as well. And then maybe forming a parent committee that is representative of the student population. And that is something that I also see the need for, but haven't actually seen the evidence of very often in my school. And then teachers, to increase the diversity of staff. And one way to do that would be for the local high school to do a partnership with Sneed State Community College. They already do this with some health science courses and some technical courses, but it could also be done with education. And so students in the high school could join a group, maybe of future teachers of America or future educators of America, and partner with SNE to allow some dual enrollment and to have some more mentoring coming into the elementary schools from high school students. And that way, we are gleaning our best and brightest students from our system and supporting them into the field of education, and then back into our school system. And then the the references here are cited, but thank you very much, and I appreciate your attention.